Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again for another episode of the award winning Everything Compliance. We are recording this on October 31st. So happy Halloween to everyone. And we hope you have a very profitable Halloween for those who engage in such activities. So we have the quartet of Jonathan Armstrong, Karen Moore, Matt Kelly, and Karen Woody. So we're going to start with Mr. Armstrong. We'll go over to Matt, Karen Moore, and we'll finish with the professor. If we have time, I might slide in with a few thoughts on the NBA gambling scandal, but if not, you guys go full bore on 15 or 20 minutes and we'll have some fun. So, Mr. Armstrong, what is on your mind today?
Yeah, thanks very much, Tom. I've been on a sort of, I guess, a mini tour of the SEC in Nashville, Relativity Conference in Chicago, and the New York State Bar Association Conference in Hamburg. And obviously, the topic du jour at all of those has been AI. And in addition, we're starting to see the sort of almost like the shakedown of the EU AI Act and how that's being interpreted in Europe. There's obviously quite a lot of activity around things like AI literacy that we've talked about already, which is obligatory from February gone if you have AI that touches Europe. But Italy has just passed its own AI legislation, which is meant to sort of, I guess, fit hand in glove with the EU AI Act. And the intention is manifold, but part of what it's looking at is the undermining of restricted professions by AI. So, for example, um, I've a friend of a family member who died because he Googled quack remedies on the internet. You know how to cure cancer by drinking bleach, and unfortunately ended up not curing himself, but hastening his own demise. And so maybe I'm oversensitive to these type of things, but Italy are getting very worried about this, about people self-diagnosing with unregulated AI applications, about the impact of AI on the judicial process and the judiciary. So the Act is trying in part to address that. And in Hamburg, I had a panel of judges discussing AI and how that might have an effect on justice and the future of the court system. Of course, a lot of people think that AI can take cost out of the court system. They are wrong. It will not, at least in the short term. And the reason for that is the same as people downloading quack remedies. People download quack solutions to legal problems off the internet, turn up in court, often as litigants in person. They require a lot of judicial time for judges to tell them that they're wrong, and then they still don't listen because they've read it on the internet. We've had a case, for example, of a qualified lawyer who produces a hallucinated case. By the way, hallucination equals lie. We use hallucination to sort of dress up something that is just an untruth. He produces a hallucinated case in court. The judge or the tribunal chair says to him, "Are you sure?" He says, "Yes, I'm sure." They say, "We're going to need some persuading. We're going to adjourn for lunch early. Produce us a transcript of this case if you say it exists." And he uses his lunchtime to go to ChatGPT and say, "Court doesn't believe me. Produce me a transcript of this case that you've mentioned," and gets another 9 pages of guff that he hands into court. So that's disturbing enough, and the impact on the judicial system. But even more disturbingly, I had judges from Germany, US, and South Korea on the panel in Hamburg. And one judge, who I'll respect the sanctity of the room, said, "Well, this is sort of not the worst problem. The worst problem is that we have discovered hallucinations in court judgments, and that basically some members of the bench are lazy enough that they've outsourced the judgment to AI. They might have decided which parties won, but they've then let AI generate the judgment that justifies that decision. And that So he said often those errors have gone unmissed because both parties effectively have shut up shop. One's lost, one's won, and they've gone away. And then we had a wider discussion about actually what happens in that case. So the appeal process might take 18 months. Obviously, I know in the US, you might go along to the judge's clerks and say, a mistake has been made. Can we correct this? In the UK, there's something called the slip rule. But apparently, in other jurisdictions, that just doesn't exist. So you'd have to go through some sort of appeal process, which is endless. And so I think hallucination is a big problem in the law. You know, we're up to 487 cases, I think, this morning in 22 countries. It doesn't just affect the UK and the US. Countries like Tanzania, Trinidad and Tobago, Zimbabwe have had issues with hallucination. And then I think it also affects corporations. I was talking to a lawyer this morning who does sanctions and export control business. And he says that a lot of the simple queries, you know, can I export from A to B? He believes they're now being answered by AI. So his practice has moved from getting relatively short, simple queries from clients to disastrous things like, you know, for example, we understood Norway was in the EU, so we've exported a whole load of stuff to the EU because ChatGPT told us it was. And I think it's interesting that whole saving time, saving money gift of AI does work with some AI applications, but not all. And then my really final point on it is liability for AI. So a lot of people will say, well, we're not dumb enough to use unlicensed product. We're going to use Copilot and we're going to pay a proper license and we're going to have enterprise grade AI. But have you looked at the terms and conditions? A recent survey says 88% of vendors cap their liability at the annual cost of the software. So if you're only paying, let's say, $10,000 for that software, but it makes a $500,000 mistake, you can collect your $10,000 if you win, but not the balance. And only 17% of AI vendors give any form of compliance warranty, apparently. So this is an area where not only is some of the outputs unreliable, but also your ability to do anything about it when you act on that unreliable information is limited. So why should compliance officers care? Well, I think firstly, because it illustrates the whole issue of AI literacy, the need to educate people in the business that AI has its upsides and its downs. Is that the compliance officer's job? Well, I don't know. But as I've said before, nobody in the organization seems to own it as their job. If you look at CISOs, for example, I'm speaking at a CISO conference next week. CISOs don't think it's their job. They think it's compliance's job. I'm not laying down a ground rule for your organization and whose responsibility it is. I'm just saying somebody has to be responsible for it. Somebody has to have an education program, and somebody has to look at use of AI and whether the boring stuff like indemnities are sorted out. Because another panel in Hamburg told us that insurers are saying, we're not picking up the tab for that. So it's not going to go on your regular insurance policy. Who is going to cover that loss? And what are you going to do to manage that risk?
Well, Matt, do you have a question or comment for Jonathan?
Oh, many, many things. And you should know that even when we're done discussing this AI, I know I'm up next on the roster and I have other AI to talk about.
Good.
But I mean, Jonathan, what fascinates me is that if you take some of these arguments now that people are making about AI and you reimagine them with human employees, none of this would make sense. And
Mm,
it points to how the legal and regulatory framework for how are we really going to use AI, this is nowhere near ready for prime time when AI is rushing on stage. I was on a webinar just yesterday where somebody gave a great example about hallucinations. Imagine you have an employee who is really great 97% of the time, but they have an error rate 3% of the time. It's not the error rate that matters. It's the nature of the error. You have an employee who 3% of the
mm,
time gives you the wrong answer because they just make stuff up. That's a hallucination. What
mm,
would you do with an employee like that? You would fire their rear end before Friday. And you just, it wouldn't work. Nobody would stand for that because of the nature of the error. Or to your point about liability for AI and that software vendors are only going to cover the cost of the software. So imagine you have outside counsel, they give you a wrong answer, and that firm says, well, sure, we'll indemnify you for the cost of the monthly retainer.
mm.
If somebody proposed that, there would be a mob of general counsels with tar and pitchforks and torches burning that firm to the ground. So, but it's going to be okay if it's a virtual lawyer giving virtual advice. Like, it's not supposed to work that way. Period. So I have all sorts of concerns about that. The only other thing I do actually have a question. Getting back to when Italy unveiled its AI framework, I guess I was a bit curious about like why did Italy do that when in theory the AI Act applies across all European nations? You didn't need to do that, Italy, although they felt the need to do it. And listeners should beware that we're starting to see this elsewhere around the world. Just this month, Australia has rolled out a framework for AI adoption. Singapore has rolled out a framework for AI adoption. Neither one of them are, I think, as mandatory and restrictive as the EU AI Act, but clearly we're getting there. And US
Mm.
states are going to do the same too. But I don't know, like, why did Italy decide to do this when my reading of the EU AI Act was they didn't have to, or maybe even
Yeah,
they shouldn't have?
I think it's a really good question, and I think to use a Halloween appropriate analogy, basically under EU law we have either a directive or a regulation, and a directive is meant to be like a skeleton, and a regulation is meant to be a fully formed ghoul, if you like, and um, and the regulation is meant to be of general effect across Europe, and the directive is going to be different because you've only set out the bones and not the flesh. The difficulty we've got is the EU AI Act is it's meant to be a regulation, but it isn't fully formed. So nation states are going to look at it like a skeleton, like a directive, and add their own stuff on top, which is, I think, what's really happened here with Italy. And they've added in some of the stuff that people couldn't get consensus on, like copyright as well, is one of the other areas where they've sought to legislate. And then the other thing to think about is that Italy has a track record of AI enforcement already. The Garante, the Italian Data Protection Authority, has probably brought, I would say off the top of my head, 140, 160,000 dollars worth of fines. So they've fined, Replica AI, they've suspended ChatGPT for a while, they've fined Clearview AI for biometrics. They've taken action against a local authority for surveillance cameras. So they've been very active in terms of AI regulation, and that just seems to be an Italian thing. Probably it's, if you psychoanalyzed the Italian population, it probably all goes back to Mussolini and that fear of Big Brother spying on them, which was obviously very warranted in the Mussolini era and is still in the national psyche. So, and the danger we get, of course, is whenever we've got a skeleton, not a fully formed body, that people add different fleshly, supplements to it. So, from a US corporate point of view, that's always a challenge. That's like data protection law pre GDPR, when you've got micro changes in different jurisdictions. So if you roll out a product in 15 different countries in the EU, you've got to do 15 different regulatory analyses. So whilst I can see why Italy's done that, I don't think it's good news for consistency, and I think it will create issues.
I do believe the monster we're groping for then is a Frankenstein as we're grafting new pieces on.
That'll do.
Karen, do you have a question? Karen Moore, do you have a question or a comment?
I do. I have a comment. I mean, just reflecting. I was born on the cusp between Libra and Aries. I studied in the Soviet Union and then worked in the Russian Federation. I studied law at a time where you had to go to the law library to look up and shepherdize cases, but I worked as a clerk for a judge when Lexis was online, and so you could do some of that online. And now I'm thinking about the comments you made about the court system, Jonathan, and I'm wondering if you can draft a motion using AI, and then the motions or the pleadings are analyzed by AI, and the judgment is written by AI, is all the AI just reconfirming each other, and you end up with this incredible outcome that looks like it's all consistent, and yet it isn't. I mean, part of my job as a clerk for the judge was looking up every single case that was cited and making recommendations as to whether it really supported or didn't support strongly enough the assertions being made by either side. And where's that going?
Yeah, I think some of the hallucination problems have been a little bit like that, because some of the early judgment in hallucination cases have said, I was brought the case of X, which doesn't exist. And the judge has put that in her judgment. What has then happened is AI has crawled that judgment, seen the reference to the case that doesn't exist, but not the words that said this case doesn't exist. And so when you've asked this application to confirm that this case exists, it said, yes, it does exist. It was referred to in the judgment of this court. So a number of courts, I believe it's best practice now in the UK and in Australia, that the judges have been discouraged from referring to the case that didn't exist by name, because that seems to be propagating the problem each time. And it is that whole issue of almost Gen AI eating its own dog food. It's sort of getting affirmation from things that are denial. Some of the cases are slightly laughable. One of the cases, the advocate produced this list of cases and said, and it's judgment in such and such a case, and the judge says, well, I don't think that happened in this case, and the advocate says to the judge, are you sure? And she says, well, I should be, because I was the judge in that case and I didn't say it. It's and it's slightly laughable, but when we're relying on happenstance to catch bad things happening, then I think there's a problem. I realize that it should be easy to verify cases using things like LexisNexis tools, but of course, maybe 50% of the problem, maybe slightly more, is lawyers who are self-represented and they don't have access to those paid for tools. They're just relying on free to air stuff, which can be inaccurate.
Well, I have a few thoughts. First of all, judges always make mistakes, and there are mistakes in every opinion. And sometimes you can get them corrected and sometimes you can't. And at least in the great state of Texas, there's a pretty robust way to do that, and that's called motion for rehearing. And if you file a motion for rehearing and you point out to the court, you've made a mistake on this case, and you're right, and it's a good day for the judge, they might grant your motion. So judges always make mistakes. Number two, I've been a software lawyer since 2004. And if you've never read a software contract and you're on the other side of that, be prepared to get screwed. Because one, there is no warranty, because you can't give a warranty on 1 million lines of code. Number two, you're right on the limitation of liability. typically it's for the cost of the software. And three, you can forget an indemnity because it's generally limited to intentional conduct. Now, there should be open negotiations over these, but there never is. Because
Mm.
one, customers always take them. And two, when you push back, lawyer for the software company goes, oh, we don't need your $3,000. Thank you very much. So the imbalance in negotiating those contracts, it can be very large. And I had a few enterprise clients. E&I was one of them that actually we had to go through the contract word by word, and I had to explain all that to them, and they just scoffed at me. So unless you're an enterprise customer with a large amount of negotiating power, you're going to get those. So, but that's been around at least for 20 years. But mistakes are always made. It's just a matter of correcting them. So, Professor, do you have any thoughts on any of the legal topics we've touched on for this topic?
No, but I love that. I love that law is and judges are very fallible. That's a tricky starting point to jump from, but fair.
Well, welcome to the great state of Texas. All right. Well, on to Matt Kelly. Matt, you can continue the AI rant.
Well, I'm going to take it from a different perspective here, that we have some really interesting research that came out the other week from EQS, which is a compliance vendor, and a German compliance association known as, let me make sure I get their acronym right, that they are known as BCM. I will not attempt to pronounce the German name, because if I did, we'd be here all afternoon. But they looked at large language models such as Gemini, ChatGPT, Anthropic, to see how good those large language models are at handling various types of compliance tasks. And it's really interesting because it shows that at discrete tasks, most of these models are pretty good. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can easily slot them into a big functioning compliance program, because there are a lot of risks around model management. I guess that's going to become a thing now that compliance officers really need to appreciate. So let me first take a minute to unpack what EQS and BCM did. They looked at 6 large language models. So these are the real frontier models that we're spending $2 trillion and we're building data centers the size of the moon to process it and all that stuff. These are the real brains that run AI. And most of the AI apps you're encountering when you see a compliance vendor who says, hey, we use AI, they are reselling the brains from one of these large language models. They've layered their product on top of that. We'll get back to that in a bit, because that's an important detail too. But they looked directly at the 6 models. They gave them 120 different compliance tasks, such as evaluate this whistleblower report, interpret this conflict of interest disclosure, what else do we need to know? And you could read all of that in the report if you want. 120 different compliance tasks. And then they assessed each one. How well did it perform? All 6 performed pretty good, somewhere between pretty good up to excellent. So the best that they found with the highest overall score was Gemini 2.5, which scored 88%, if I'm looking correctly, 87%. Now, what does that mean? No, it does not mean they are 87% as good as a human compliance officer. No, it does not mean they are good at 87% of compliance tasks. It's a bit of like this nuanced, generalized score, kind of like if you score 87% on a math test, does that mean that you get 87% of all problems right? Well, not necessarily. It means you're pretty good at math, but there's a long list of potential math problems you'll encounter in your lifetime. But they also then broke down those 120 tasks into different types of thinking: data extraction, data analysis, content generation. Some of the models were better at some things than other things. So, for example, Anthropic had a lower overall score than Gemini, but it scored higher than Gemini on data extraction. But it scored worse than Gemini on data analysis. And then ChatGPT scored better at data extraction and content generation, but worse at data mapping and much worse at gap analysis than Gemini did. So think about what that means if you're a compliance officer and your CFO is saying it's time for us to integrate AI into our program. How are you supposed to figure that out? Would you use ChatGPT for some things, but Anthropic for other things, and then Gemini for other things? And you're going to use multiple models for exactly the tasks that they're the best at? Or are you going to use Gemini because it's pretty good at most stuff, but it's not necessarily going to be the best at certain things? But maybe you don't have to worry about those things as much, so that's okay. Or let's go back to what I said before. You want to use multiple models so you always have the best model doing the exact thing that you need, and it's all these models doing great stuff. Your IT manager and your CISO are going to strangle you if you propose that, because it is going to be a humongous problem for them thinking about IT governance and cybersecurity and everything else, because you have multiple models doing everything awesomely instead of one model that's pretty good at most stuff most of the time. All of that, by the way, let me just say, remember 10 minutes ago, we said 3% error rate where they make stuff up. So, okay, Gemini's great most of the time at most things, except, the 3% of the time where it makes something up and you have no idea if it's trustworthy or not. So you still have all these traditional risk assurances you need to think about. That's one big issue. The other big conclusion that they found was that the performance of these models can change radically over time. So you've made a big bet on one model right now, and now 18 months from now, they come out with ChatGPT 6 or something like that. Other people tell me we do not have enough energy on the planet to be able to deliver ChatGPT 6, but whatever, you get the idea that what if a new model comes out in 12 or 18 months that's going to be even better, but you've lashed yourself to the mast of a different model? How are you going to handle that? Now, let me get back to the vendors, because I said this would be important. All of the vendors who are coming to you with AI capabilities, they are all relying on one of these 6 or 7 models in the world. So are they telling you that? Are they disclosing which model they're using to you? Is that model in step with what you want to do? What if it's not? What if they've decided to switch from one model to another model? Has your contract declared that you will be that fact will be disclosed to you? How are you going to assess how they're training and testing that AI model for their product before they resell that on to you? Long-winded way of saying that, yes, AI is really capable at a lot of point-specific AI compliance tasks. It's not perfect, and the risks of imperfection could be considerable, especially the nature of the imperfection and the nature of the flaw. But there's still going to be an awful lot of third-party risk management you have to think about. There's going to be an awful lot of risk assessment you have to think about. And when we go from point-specific task where AI is awesome to I'm relying on AI to manage a whole host of processes, it gets a lot harder. And I am still unconvinced that AI is ready for prime time. All of these 6 models, by the way, let's not forget, they do not make any money. At some point, they are going to ask for more money, because if they do not, they will eventually lose money for real and go out of business, as all money-losing businesses do. What happens when they triple, quadruple, quintuple the price that you are paying? They are giving it away at a discount now to lock you in for later when they put the screws to you. Do you have a threshold at which point you'll say, this is no longer worth it? I'm going to go back to using people. Spoiler, the answer is no, you don't. Nobody has thought of this yet. But when you look at the underlying economics of these AI data centers and the AI models, everything's going to be great and it's going to be awesome when everybody's paying $2 trillion a year by the year 2030 to make AI profitable. Nobody explains how that happens. So let's just be aware that AI has tremendous capabilities with a whole lot of risk that you're going to have to manage. And by the way, the money doesn't yet make sense, and there's no clear path to when it will. Think about it. That is all.
Karen, Woody, what do you have for Matt?
I have a question about this, the premise even of the questionnaire or the test, I guess they gave all these. And that is, and I think you said this, that the 100%, the gold standard here is actually not a human though. So I guess my question is, if we do go back to people, like really what we're trying to get at is that delta between what maybe is the best human score on this versus the AI. Because if we can take as a given that no one's going to ace this, I guess that's sort of my question, is that I see your point about all the risks and all the sort of potential issues with AI, but I could also just have a terrible chief compliance officer, I guess, too, if I were a company. That was my question.
I mean, that's fair. You could. And I do think that I'm still myself not entirely clear on how we take these test scores for software and try and reimagine what would that look like with people. Keep in mind, most of the time you wouldn't have a single person doing all compliance things. I know there are some listeners there saying, dude, that's exactly what my compliance program is. It's just me. But you get what I mean, that compliance is a bunch of processes that a human handles soup to nuts. And what we're looking at is more compliance broken down into fundamental tasks and how well can software do that. Interestingly enough, I also happened to see another AI person I know, and he was looking at AI agents trying to develop software. And they're taking the same sort of approach, that software development has many different phases and processes all into one big process of developing code. So the agents are trying to track it down and break it down, and each agent is dedicated to a specific thing. And he said, they're pretty good at their specific thing, but the agents still can't talk to each other well to develop a whole piece of software like a human software team would. And he came across one instance where two agents were talking to each other in an infinite loop and nobody knew it. And they racked up $50,000 in compute time. And it took humans 6 weeks to undo the mess that these two agents had done. So those are the kind of things that we're going to struggle with, I think, is to reimagine how much can we trust certain AI agents on certain tasks? How much can we trust a certain big brain that we're using as a tool rather than an agent? What about, can the humans do this or not? And, go back to my 3% error rate thing again. If you had a human who made stuff up 3% of the time, you'd probably fire them. But if you had a human who was really trying and made small errors 3% of the time, but they were working at it, you probably would not fire that person. You'd probably train them to get the error rate down. And you would probably have a whole pipeline of talent management that they're brought in at the start as a compliance analyst. So if they're wrong 3% of the time, it's not going to derail the whole company. So I don't know that I really answered your question, Karen, but it's a good one that we're still struggling to figure out. How does AI really reflect how humans work and how does it not? And if it doesn't, how do we manage that? And I don't think we know.
Mr. Armstrong.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you made a really good point about, paraphrasing horses for courses, that quite often we use specialists for different things. We had a trial with some real data and a real case last week on subject access request responses. So subject access requests under GDPR have got way more aggressive, particularly from employees who've just left or think they're leaving. And I've got at least circumstantial evidence that AI has made that worse because you're getting more aggressive, more detailed requests that are talking about case law, etc. So we've rigged up a tool using some existing e-discovery software that's proven, been in existence, developed from technology-assisted review, so got a long lineage of testing. And we tested that on subject access request responses to get it to select relevant documents, prepare them for extraction, do redactions. And it was pretty good at a lot of stuff, to be honest. Because we're super cautious, we took 15% of the rejected documents to test it. So the industry average seems to be 10%, so we took 15 and manually tested them. You're right, Karen, it's somewhat subjective. So which human do you get to test it, and would they reach a different decision? but we were pretty happy with the results. So I'm not saying that I'm against AI completely. I think there are good AI applications. I spoke at an event with Ground Truth Intelligence this week, and we demoed an AI, or we looked at some results from an AI due diligence tool to do third-party due diligence, which I thought was pretty good. So there's tried and tested tech out there, but I think that's in niche specialist products rather than relying on Gen AI to sort of all of a sudden become a specialist in that particular area. And I guess it's a difference between, is Gen AI good as an intern? Probably yes. Can it get through a lot of work and help suggest answers? Yes. But you're still going to need some sort of specialist application to do the specialist stuff. And I guess what you still need is the as well. The human in the loop.
Human in the
Human in
loop.
the loop. Yeah.
Jonathan, I would just want to say, I do think one interesting point you raised there was that people seem to be using AI to make more fulsome and aggressive subject access requests.
Yeah.
We all need to remember that as much as we are using AI to streamline operations and save time, others are using AI as well. And it seems like you're going to need every single bit of spare time you can get, because other people's use of AI is going to wind up putting tremendous burdens on you.
Yeah.
Don't even get me started on fraud. That great, your anti-fraud program is working like a bullet train, because anti-fraud is going to be swamped by AI-driven fraud. We don't have an answer for that yet. Data subject access requests is another example of the same thing. Other people using AI is going to leave you reeling. And, we need to think about that too.
Yeah.
Karen Moore, question or comment?
Yeah, it's just building on what both of you were just talking about. I think for compliance programs, I've been talking to quite a few compliance officers about how they can start bringing it in. And the answer really is slowly, dip your toe in the water and try and find some low level tasks that you can assign where 97% positive outcome is unbelievably fantastic, or where you can at least live with the 3%. And I've used, conflicts of interest as a testing ground for a couple of companies where it's essentially a glorified decision tree. But the issue is, and I think both of you raised it, is that it also creates work, because you have to keep going back and refining the instructions that you give. You have to go back to the output and at least sample and test and audit, some of the outcomes to make sure that they're still on track. You have to make sure that it's kind of kicking out the more complex ones so that you can deal with those maybe more manually. You have to then also be ready to have people, contest the outcome. My conflict wasn't approved and I think it should have been. So all of that, also creates work at the same time that it's maybe kicking out some of the low level work, or I think more importantly for compliance metrics, it's speeding up outcomes in a way that's really positive. But once you start asking the AI to do things like, can you detect patterns in the organization based on the data that we have that give rise to potential undisclosed conflicts, that you really start creating both the problems that both of you have identified and the amount of work that you need to anticipate, that somebody's now going to have to take all these identified potential conflicts and investigate them, things you might not have known about. So it becomes this kind of loop of AI isn't going to solve your staffing problems. And, Matt, the point that you made, which I noted down because I think it's a little bit alarming, it may not just not solve, but actually exacerbate some of your budget problems as well. So knock-on effects. So I say toe in the water. Start with a, kind of 4-function calculator approach.
Well, Karen, you want to continue as we transition over to you and some news on sustainability from the EU?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, we're recording this on Halloween, and I feel like I'm in the twilight zone a little bit because I've talked so much about the EU sustainability framework. It's kind of like it's happening. No, it's not happening. I guess it's not going to get approved. Oh, it's just been approved unexpectedly. Now it's been delayed. So we have a little bit of news. I think that continues a little bit that twilight zone, but we're getting there. Just a reminder, we're talking primarily about two main pieces of legislation: the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or CSRD, and the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or the CSDDD. And Jonathan has already very beautifully laid out a reminder that there's a difference in the EU between directive and regulation. The directives, even once they enter into force, still need to be transposed into national legislation, unlike the regulations. And so we're seeing pretty good transposition rates on the CSRD. So now we have, I think, about 20 member state national pieces of legislation that are designed to implement CSRD. A few that haven't. I jotted it down somewhere, and I will give a shout out at one point to some. There's a really good online tool that will let you look country by country. It gives you how many companies are affected, links to the actual national legislation, and a little bit of an overview as well. I found that really helpful. So we have that. It's in force. It was meant to really start operating, but it's been subject to a lot of challenges. CSDDD was intended to come in a little bit after that. So we've got CSRD enter into force 6th of July with kind of stepped in enforcement, whereas CSDDD entry into force with the transposition deadline at the end of July 2026. So then, just to kind of jump into the middle of the story, we've got a big meeting of the EU member states in Budapest, and they're like, hey, we're not really sure that we're doing ourselves a favor in terms of EU corporate competitiveness in the world market. We need to take a look at some of our regulations and make sure that they're not really becoming overly burdensome. And as a result of that, the EU Commission in February this year put together an omnibus proposal, which is designed to promote European business and a desire to simplify and harmonize the whole sustainability framework and the requirements. And so it proposes amendments to CSRD and CSDDD. Now, I am absolutely and a big fan of simplification and harmonization. I think companies don't often enough, in corporate compliance programs, don't often enough take a look at complex business processes and see how they can be reconciled and simplified. I am just going to pause and take a check because all of you are frozen. Oh, no, not now. So I'm coming through okay in my little web of stories. Okay. So the EU Commission puts together this omnibus proposal in February, and then we get, kind of the complex EU system. You get the Council, which puts together its proposal on how CSRD and CSDDD might be simplified. And then you get the Parliament, which puts together its proposal, and then you try and see if they can all come together into these amendments. Now, the difficulty, I think, in simplification sometimes is oversimplification. And in short, the proposed amendments to the CSRD that were part of this omnibus proposal reduces about 80% of the in-scope companies. So now you've kicked out requirements on sustainability reporting for the bulk of companies either operating in the EU directly through EU incorporation or through subsidiaries. And it recommends an increase to in-scope to companies that have 1,000 employees, if they're EU companies, and $450 million in turnover, which is up from 50 million in turnover, which was the Commission proposal. And then the non-EU companies, it's 450 million in EU generated net turnover, which seems aligned with both the Council and the Commission. So that one looks pretty robust. And then you have the CSDDD recommendations, which will kick out about 70% of the currently in scope companies. upping the threshold. And remember, the CS-DDD is really the due diligence. It's where so much of the work has to be done. So it ups the threshold of employees to 5,000 employees, okay, but $1.5 billion in turnover. So now we've got a relatively small number of companies that are in scope. It limits the in-depth assessment. It provides things much more at the control of the companies themselves. They have to voluntarily choose to produce sustainability reports if they're smaller companies within the supply chain. There's less frequent monitoring, narrows the definition of stakeholders to those directly affected. It limits now, instead of all the way down through the supply chain, what I was calling the blueberry muffin conundrum, where a company that is in scope might have to go so far down their supply chain that they need to know where the blueberries for the blueberry muffins purchased from a bakery were picked. But it solves that by kind of backing way back and saying, okay, just your direct supply chain, your immediate things. And I think most importantly, and probably most of interest to promoting sustainability, it completely, promoting competitiveness and not sustainability. It completely removes a harmonized system of penalties and leaves it up to each member state to say what it might implement for penalties. It also, the omnibus proposal kind of pushes out implementation, transposition, and everything by several years. So we've got also a huge delay in which almost anything can happen. Now, the interesting thing is that Parliament met and put together a proposal through its Legal Affairs Committee earlier this month. And then, and here is the cliffhanger news of the day, met on the 22nd of October and very narrowly defeated the Parliament proposal, right? So we have the Commission omnibus proposal, we have the Council proposal, now we have Parliament, which had a proposal and actually rejected the proposal put forward to it by its own Legal Affairs Committee. Now, it was a very narrow defeat. It was 309 in favor, 318 against, and 34 abstaining. So now it's got to go back to Parliament for their plenary session. They're probably relatively close, especially interestingly in the last few weeks because of this parliamentary meeting and vote. We have the National Association of Manufacturers in the US saying that this proposal, this whole structure, undermines US sovereignty. The CEO of ExxonMobil saying that it's a bone-crushing burden. US and Qatar, interestingly, submitted a joint letter from the Ministry of State for Energy Affairs and our own US Secretary for Energy, Chris Wright, saying that this whole framework needs to be abolished or rethought. We have 46 European companies who signed a letter to French President Macron and German Chancellor Merz saying that the whole CS-DDD should be repealed in its entirety, although some of the French companies are now backing out, saying we didn't really mean for that to be quite so strong as it was. So in the wake of all that, the kind of review and rejection by Parliament is operating in this very intense political environment. So I won't be surprised to see the plenary session of Parliament in November pretty much approving most, if not all, of the changes. It then, in the way of all things EU, goes into trilogue negotiations. That's where the Commission gets to play referee between the Council and Parliament to try and reconcile some of the differences. But I would expect that some of these really big effect ones, not some of the smaller details, but the big effect ones like raising the number of employees and the value of turnover, kicking out a lot of companies that this might apply to, is going to be retained in some form or another. Doesn't mean that companies shouldn't still be kind of taking a look, getting ready. Certainly, if you are operating in the EU, you're already thinking about in scope, not in scope. But if you're in the supply chain, even if you're not actively in the EU and you're in the supply chain to EU companies, you're going to want to take a look, especially if that blueberry conundrum somehow survives the proposal to limit it to direct suppliers. So that's where we are. Cliffhanger.
All right. Karen Woody, we had a very interesting Caremark case. We've had Caremark ebb and flow over the past few years, and it had perhaps ebbed a little bit, but now we have a case that perhaps expands it. Or is this just another example of bad facts make bad law?
Well, I mean, we shall see it. I mean, here we are again talking Caremark, and I have to say, I just taught this to my law students a few weeks ago and was on record saying I don't think we'll see any of these again right before this case, mostly because where we landed or where we ended up was Caremark claims being successful against Boeing. And then we also had the McDonald's case with sexual harassment. All that has been discussed actually on this podcast before. But these were egregious, I mean, planes falling out of the sky situations. So all of these seem to be very fact specific and also kind of in hindsight, like these are terrible. I mean, think about even the origin story of this is Bluebell ice cream is killing people and it was their only product. So you had these, I would have thought, sort of one-off particular circumstance type situations. But we had another one come out in just about a month ago from the Delaware Chancery Court. And this one deals with Regions Bank, which is obviously a bank. It's headquartered in Alabama, but a Delaware corporation. And sort of the backstory here is that this all deals with overdraft fees. So the context to this involves the CFPB, the once robust agency of our government that, usually went after banks or other type of lending institutions. And beginning as far back as 2010, the CFPB really heralded this idea that it was going to ramp up investigations into banks over a number of things, but particularly overdraft practices. And so you saw a slew of settlements from big banks in the 2011, I think was Bank of America, then JP Morgan a year later, Wells Fargo sometime around that time. But that was one of sort of the major projects, and certainly one of, I think, one of the things the CFPB was very proud of how much work it had done on this particular issue. So fast forward to around 2019, the CFPB enters into a consent order that year with USAA, Federal Savings Bank. And so I just marked that time because in 2019, this is another one of these overdraft fees. That prompts Regions Bank to start looking into their own practices. So all this is happening 2018, 2019. The Regions Bank Board, stands up a working group to review their overdraft practices. And, this is flowing to the risk and even the audit committee. So there are some procedures maybe to look at what's going on with these particular policies that could create some liability risk for them. So around the same time, that board receives a draft complaint from the company's former general counsel or deputy general counsel, but his name is Jeffrey Lee, so it's deemed the Lee complaint. And in that complaint, he alleges a number of things, some of which seems a little off the wall. I mean, including things like he was subjected to reverse discrimination when they hired a woman instead of him because he had since left the company. But he says that's, he claims he's fired over all these same things. So he has some sort of out there allegations. But one of the allegations in the complaint is that he details the bank's history of violating regulations around the overdraft fees. So that alone was something that maybe should have raised eyebrows is the thought. So when that happens, again, November 2019, he is saying, by the way, I've raised this working group is not even doing anything about it. And they're not even actually empowered to stop this practice. And so all this is baked into this complaint letter. The company at that point engages the law firm of Buckley, formerly Buckley Sander, A lot of my actually former colleagues from Skadden went over to Buckley, and they did this work all the time, the CFPB work. And they undertake a bit of a internal investigation into this and send a memo with certain conclusions to the audit committee, which the company doesn't exactly do much about initially. Around the same time, COVID hits, so in 2020, and the bank gets letters from senators and others really decrying the use of any overdraft fees sort of in this national crisis era. So those data points are all sort of in the mix. When, sure enough, in 2022, the CFPB comes knocking at Regions Bank door. And lo and behold, they end up entering into a consent order that involves 141 million in overdraft fees and things like that. So they end up having a deal with the CFPB that required them to pay a $50 million penalty, and all in addition to that, 141 million in fees that should go back to consumers. So all in 191 million. So again, as we could all set our watches to, there is of course a follow-on shareholder complaint on this. And so a shareholder brings this complaint alleging that this was clear a Caremark violation, that the board was too slow in reacting to the red flags, and the red flags being obviously the general counsel's complaint or sort of whistleblower complaint, the senator's letters, and also doing more with the previous USAA bank that was happening at the same time. That all this is happening, the board should have been more aware of what was going on. I will say, without having to get too in the weeds about the process here, but this was first a derivative complaint. So she's bringing this, the shareholders bring this on behalf of the company, like alleging a corporate injury. And what is required in Delaware is to allege that you first bring that to the board. So you make a demand on the board to bring a lawsuit on behalf of the company. This never actually happens. And so, of course, one of the first fights is to say, I didn't ask the board to look at this because that would be futile. So the argument is really a demand futility argument, meaning the company was injured. The board is supposed to handle that, but there's no reason to ask the board to handle that because they all have their hand in the pot. They all have skin in this game, and so there's no reason to ask them to do something. So what is before the Delaware Chancery Court is demand futile. Can the complaint go forward because there's no reason to have the board review this? And amazingly, the Chancery Court says yes. They win the demand futility case, allowing this case in theory to go forward, at least as it is against the directors who were on the board at the time of these red flags. And I guess I should also clarify, lest we forget, Caremark liability means these directors are personally liable, meaning $190 million needs to be found among these defendant directors. So the takeaway here is this is another sort of high watermark in Caremark being allowed to move forward. The plaintiffs tried to bring Caremark 1 and 2 prong theory here, meaning Caremark 1 prong is you didn't have any system to review this, and Caremark 2 is, okay, you had a system to review certain things, but you ignored the red flags. The court quickly dismisses the prong 1 and says, of course, they had some system. They had the board reviewing this, even set up this working group. So that one gets tossed fairly quickly. But they did, spend some time saying, well, is there enough here under Caremark to suggest that there are significant red flags and that the board denied them or ignored them? And they said, yeah, I think, again, for those red flags theory, you have to be able to sufficiently connect the corporate trauma, which they're defining as the CFPB outcome, the agreement with the CFPB, is that sufficiently related to the red flags being brought to the board and then the board's inaction in the face of those red flags. If that is all shown, that basically can prove, or at least is enough of an inference of bad faith, which is what is required to win a Caremark claim, or at least to get your case into court. So again, as I said, there's sort of three types of red flags the plaintiff alleges is the senator's letters, the other bank's consent order, and then the general counsel's complaint. The court says the senator's letters, not enough. They sent that to every bank. That's not enough to suggest there's red flags at Regions Bank. They sort of say the same about the other bank's complaint, like, we know this was the type of thing the CFPB was going after. That in itself doesn't rise to the level of suggesting there are problems at Regions Bank. But they do allow this red flag from the whistleblower complaint to constitute enough for Caremark review, which is interesting because we've seen a few whistleblower complaints not rising to the level of suggesting it is a red flag under Caremark. But so what is different here? The fact that it is coming from the former general counsel, I think the court really makes clear the context of this particular whistleblower complaint is significant. And then the court really looked at what then did the board do in the face of that. One, they delayed a decent amount before they did anything about changing their overdraft policy. Amazingly, the court said the use of or the hiring of a law firm to look into this didn't cleanse that delay. They said, yeah, that's great. There's not even enough evidence that you put into effect any of the suggestions of the law firm. So all these things sort of in the broader context suggest that demand was futile, that the board at that time wouldn't be able to review whether or not there was a corporate injury because they were likely acting in bad faith. I will say, again, just the process here does make clear that it's not to say that the defendants wouldn't win this in court. So this isn't exactly a decision on the merits of actual proof of bad faith, but it is all that really matters in that if you have cleared the motion to dismiss stage, we likely are going to get very quickly into settlement discussions. And that is really the whole ball game for Caremark. And so the idea that this whistleblower complaint and the delay on any action of the board is enough to clear the Caremark hurdle, suggesting that that is enough for bad faith, is a little bit of a shift, given that Caremark is always hard to prove. And so this one, I think, was a very close call. And unlike some of these other Caremark cases we've seen, wasn't sort of this unbelievably egregious set of facts. So it's for that reason, I think it's a very important new data point for this area of the law. I'll stop there.
Karen Moore, do you have a question or comment for Karen Woody?
Yeah, just a quick question. It's always good to see kind of new light on Caremark cases, so we're not talking about the same ones. But I agree, this one's a little harder one to talk about than airplanes and ice cream. A little harder to track. But my question for you is, we always talk about Caremark claims within the Delaware Chancery context. Have you seen other courts in similar kinds of standard setting decisions? And I'm thinking about this particularly in this kind of shift over to Nevada and the great state of Texas in terms of incorporation, whether we're going to stop seeing these kinds of derivative suits or we're going to see different kinds of outcomes. Just wondering if that's something you'd
it's a great question. Caremark in theory should be really hard to bring even in Delaware. And I will note that even this type of thing is problematic because for however the common law around Caremark has gotten us to this place, particularly in the Stone v. Ritter case, Caremark claims are situated under the duty of loyalty, which makes them non-exculpable in Delaware. So it looks more almost like a conflict of interest type of thing, like you've breached your duty to the firm by not engaging in oversight. And so I've heard that maybe all fiduciary duties might be exculpable in these other states. I don't know if that's actually on the books. An expert on Nevada or Texas could probably tell me that. But I imagine the duty of care will remain exculpable in the other sort of leading states to compete with Delaware, and maybe even the duty of loyalty. Or another alternative maybe on some of this is that the D&O policies might be broader in some way. I don't know if D&O policies will shift by state or not, but that's one of the major risks here too, is that if you find a breach of the duty of loyalty, that might kick you out of potential protection from your insurance policy as well.
You should.
Yeah, should. So I guess the question is, how director friendly is Texas and Nevada going to be in that they wouldn't even allow one of these claims to move forward? And I don't know the answer if we've totally landed on that. Maybe someone could tell me if I'm wrong, but.
Well, in Texas, the law is too new and the business court is too new to have had any cases, but I'm aware of several federal court cases which have interpreted Caremark, one in San Francisco, one involving CVS, where the federal trial court upheld a $290 million verdict, Caremark verdict. So we have had federal courts interpreting Caremark. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're on to our fan favorites of shout outs and rants. We're going to shake it up a little bit. We'll have Matt Kelly, Karen Moore, Karen Woody, and batting cleanup today in honor of the World Series, Jonathan Armstrong. Mr. Kelly, what do you got?
Well, I am, while I could rant about any number of things, particularly what is going on with Washington, D.C. and the regulatory state, I'm going to put all of that aside and just give a shout out to a good friend of the compliance profession, Adam Turteltaub, who is stepping down from his role at the Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics and Healthcare Compliance Association, where he has been really the number 2 person there as their chief strategy officer, I think, since 2020. But I mean, functionally, Adam has been indispensable to the SCCC and HCCA since he joined in 2008, I guess. He's been there for 17 years, really helped both organizations build up their conferences, build up their learning academies. He launched the Compliance Perspectives podcast, which I listen to often because it is a nice, short little nugget. And Adam has just been a great guy for compliance officers everywhere. He also gave me free press passes and, more importantly, free drink tickets to the annual conference. So I think we all owe him a debt of gratitude. I'm not sure what Adam is going to do next, but good person in compliance, a loyal supporter of the compliance profession. So thank you for all of the hard work that Adam Turteltaub has done. Even though he is an LA Dodgers fan, he's still a good person.
Karen Moore.
Okay, 2 things. I said I was going to shout out this website. It's called Accountancy Europe. They're doing a really great CSRD tracker for transposition, really easy to use and informative. But the real shout out that I want to give is to mothers everywhere. I was just up at my mother's house in New York to a constant refrain of, what can I do for you? There's nothing I can do for you. I want to feel like a mother. Let me do something. Tell me some. I said, what you could do is stop asking what you can do for me. I just want to tell mothers that if you have been successful, that by the time you have a 60-year-old daughter, they don't need anything from you except maybe some unconditional love and maybe kind of a lack of criticism over their haircut. They just want to be able to spend time with you. If you've been successful, you don't need to do all that much.
Karen Woody, top that one.
I know that is hard to top. I also am going to have, I guess, a bit of a shout out and voice of encouragement and admiration to some extent for all those who are running for office. We have an election coming up here in the States very soon on Tuesday. And I, probably don't want to be overly political on this pod, but I am just hoping everyone gets out to the polls and that the best candidates win. And I, again, admire at all these days. So to everyone involved, bravo.
Mr. Armstrong.
Well, it'll shock people to know, first of all, I prepare. Secondly, I've got exactly the same result as Mr. Kelly. So I'm going to do what might be an everything compliance first, and maybe we'll shout out to the same person. So Adam Turteltaub was on my list as well. And he's probably going to hate the fact that we're shouting out to him because I think he's a modest guy. But he has definitely impacted the compliance profession. I think he's certainly welcomed me into SCCE. I got an introduction into the organization from Greg Traguba, maybe 2014, I think. I knew nobody other than Greg and Adam, and went into a room of whatever it would have been then, 250 people at SCCE in Europe. It's always always a bit of a leap of faith, isn't it, when you go into a new organization and walk into a vast hall of people you don't know. And Adam was extremely welcoming. He was always, to me, the sort of friendly face of SCCE. That's not to say that other people from the organization haven't been friendly as well, but he's very easy to spot with his height, of course, and his presence. And I think he was the glue that bound a lot of their conferences together. I think the LinkedIn comments have been really interesting, you know, to see the outreach into parts of the world where compliance is still a threatened profession rather than a valued one. And I think the SCCE will miss him. And like we've said already, very interested to know where he pops up again. But he can reflect on 17 years of hard work and pushing the compliance profession forward.
Well, I was going to talk about Adam, but I think you guys have done it better than I could. I will just only add one anecdote. I was in Cuba when you could still go to Cuba, and I came off the elevator and I looked up and I saw this big bald spot, and I went, I know that head. That's Adam Turtletop. And he turned around and there he was. And he and his wife are on a tour from UCLA. She's an officer at UCLA. So I got to see Adam in Havana. But I want to have more of a cultural moment because I want to shout out to Sean Connery. Today is the anniversary, 5th anniversary of his death. And if there is one actor that I have enjoyed literally for my entire lifetime, it has been Sean Connery. Obviously, he was James Bond, but he was so much more than that. He was King Richard. He has been Indiana Jones' father. He has been in just innumerable movies. And I just thought it was a great way to honor really one of the great action actors of the last 60 years, all the way back to I can't even remember all the way back. But so I'm going to shout out to Sean Connery and honor him and honor all of those great British actors that we're lucky enough to have. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this has been a great episode. I wanted to thank everyone for bringing their A game and can't wait to see what we can come up with next time.